Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the second session of the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program, JMHCP for short, Trauma-Informed Care across the Intercepts Virtual Learning Community. We're really glad that you joined us today. As I think you know, this learning community is for JMHCP grantees and is hosted by our office, the Council of State Governments Justice Center. And it's also funded through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, so we really appreciate that support. We're also really excited to do this learning community in collaboration with our national expert partners, Policy Research Associates. So thank you to you thank you to PRA for joining us as well. And we know how busy you all are, very busy schedule, especially these days. So we appreciate all the grantee teams taking time out of their schedules to join us today, and welcome and thank you for joining. So this next slide details, just gives a snapshot, I should say, of the agenda we're going to cover in today's session. We're going to start out with some introductions, brief introductions, and just a refresher of the goals we have for the learning community. Then we're going to turn it over to PRA to really take a deeper dive into Intercepts 2 and 3 and the use of trauma-informed care best practices and ideas, specifically in those intercepts, so that should be really interesting. We're going to spend a lot of time today as well in discussion, and we really, again, encourage you all to be as interactive as possible in this learning community. You can use your chat box, you can unmute yourself and ask questions once we get to the discussion portion, but we really encourage you to share your experiences, to share your challenges you might be having, successes or strategies that are working well, and really answer any questions that might, ask any questions that might come up during our session today. We're also going to spend some time on reviewing the exercises that you've received information about through email, the in between session exercises. So we're going to spend some time working on that, and we'll have enough time before you finish today to wrap up as well and give you some information about session number 3, our next session next month. Okay, so these are a list of the facilitators for our session today, and we'd just like to do some brief introductions. So I will turn it over to Dan to start us off. Dan?
Thanks very much, Allison, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Dan Abreu. I'm the Senior Project Associate at the Policy Research Associates. I work across a number of projects at Policy Research Associates, including the Sampson National Gains Center and the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge grantees. Probably most relevant, though, to why I'm talking about this particular topic with you is early in my career, working for the first 11 years in counties in New York State. I worked in jails, working with the mental health centers, but working in jails and in that environment. And then later, moving to the state, I was the chief of mental health services at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, and also Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is the maximum security prison for women in New York State, before taking on a position where I oversaw reentry for people leaving New York State prison and returning to the New York State community. Lisa?
Good afternoon, everybody. My voice is probably familiar to a few of you from the first webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago now. I work at PRA with Dan. We often joke that we're the seniors because we've been in the field for as long as we have. Most of the work that I do, I work across projects. Most of the projects I do work with, though, cross over at one point or another with the courts, whether it's research on mental health courts, being an instructor for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, or working in the area of competence to stand trial and working with justice partners around that. So I'm happy to be here and I'll be talking about that a little bit more as the webinar progresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Ethan Kelly, Senior Policy Analyst for the Behavioral Health Division at the Council of State Governments, and thank you all for joining again today. My role at the Justice Center is providing technical assistance to JMHCP grantees, as well as some project work with judges and psychiatrists. Again, my background is primarily in mental health and have worked in several criminal justice programs in Connecticut.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Glad to see you all back today. My name is Rachel Lee, and I'm a policy analyst here also at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I provide technical assistance to JMHCP grantees and also support a lot of the addiction project work as well. And my background is in social work, so I've worked in both inpatient and outpatient settings, and also supporting grant contracts in peer recovery services.
Thanks, Rachel. And I'm Allison Upton, project manager here at the CSG Justice Center. Glad to be here again today. And in my role at the Justice Center, I oversee the training and technical assistance for Category 3 JMHCP grantees. So that's one of those 3 categories within the JMHCP grant. And I also get the great opportunity to provide technical assistance directly and work on other project work here. My training background is as a clinical psychologist, so I've worked in, I guess, more traditional inpatient and outpatient state and city hospital settings and clinics. But most recently, I worked in local alternative to incarceration agency here in New York City, where I oversaw their jail and court-based programs. So it's just really great to have skills and training around trauma-informed care approach. I think it's useful in any setting and with anyone you come across. So I'm really glad to see so many teams attending today. So thank you to all of our facilitators for being here today. And Ethan, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the goals for today.
Thank you, Allison. So yeah, just a quick recap of the goals for the learning community. Again, we're here to identify opportunities for trauma-informed care across the sequential intercept map. We've covered Intercept 0 and 1, community and law enforcement. Today, Dan and Lisa are going to be talking about Intercepts 2 and 3, which is initial detention and pretrial. And then our third session's looking at 4 and 5, reentry and community. And I think in addition to that, regarding the exercises, another goal of this learning community is really to give grantees an opportunity to try this out in their programs, to really take a look at something that they think they can sort of walk in tomorrow in their program and have an impact on. So it's also to sort of help sort of motivate and encourage people to also take on that challenge. Next slide. So I just want to do a quick roll call, and I know that we all have done we did more formal introductions on the first one, so I'm just going to do a run through the list, and if someone from the team could just say a hello, just to sort of make that we know you're out there. So Chatham County, Georgia.
Yes, this is Charity Collier from Chatham County.
Hi, welcome. City of Lubbock, Texas. Okay. Somebody from St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, Missouri, able to make it today? Colorado Division of Criminal Justice.
This is Peggy Heil, and I'm on the call.
Hi, Peggy. Next slide. Fort Bend County, Texas.
Yes, there's 2. I believe 2 of us on the call. I'm Faye, and Neem is on the call as well.
Excellent, thank you. People from Kanatsai Indian Tribe in Alaska able to make it today? LaFourche Parish Sheriff's Office, Louisiana.
Hi, LaFourche Parish is on the call. Oh, hello?
Yep, I can hear you. You sound very far away.
Sorry, we have 3 participants from LaFourche Parish on the call.
Excellent, thank you. McLean County, Illinois.
Hi.
Yep,
Corey,
sorry.
Danelle, are you talking?
No, go ahead.
Okay, Danelle Pressburger, I believe she's on the call, and myself, Corey Tello, are here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mental Health and Recovery Services Board of Union County, Ohio.
Yes, this is Mackenzie polling on for the board.
Hi, Mackenzie. Next slide, please. Omaha Police Department, Nebraska.
Yes, Deputy Chief Michelle Bang and Officer Lee Culver are here, and a couple others may have joined as well.
Excellent. Welcome. Pima County, Arizona. Folks able to make it. Rockingham County, Virginia.
Yes, Denise Chinook is here as well as Charles Prater.
Excellent, welcome. Sacramento, California. Town of Tewksbury, Massachusetts.
Hi, this is Matthew. I'm here along with Maria from Tewksbury.
Excellent, I'm Matt. Next slide, please. Okay, looking at the session outline, we're going to move into the content areas now, looking at Intercepts 2 and 3. Next slide, please. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dan Abreu to start with Intercept 2. Dan?
Oh, Dan, I think you might be on mute.
You know, you think I would have mastered that by now, but I haven't. So I've been thanking the Justice Center for the invitation to speak and address your JMHCP grantees. And our topic today is trauma, and I want to acknowledge that this event is taking place at an unprecedented time when communities are dealing with the COVID epidemic and new urgency to address systemic racial and ethnic disparity. COVID is exposing how fragmented justice healthcare systems and community healthcare systems are. And the racial ethnic disruption and protests around the country are illuminating and bringing center stage what has been marginally addressed. Our topic being trauma, both these issues amplify the importance of addressing trauma broadly. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so what do correction officers have to learn about trauma? This came to us from a superintendent of a correction officer in Northeast Ohio. After he had arranged trauma-informed care training for his facility, it's a female facility. And the story reported, the anecdote reported, is that an officer went into an inmate cell, offender cell, who was late for count and shook the woman to wake up. The woman was startled, got up and started flailing at the officer in a very threatening way. The officer, having been trained in trauma-informed practices, rather than pulling her pin, asking for assistance, or trying to restrain the woman, took a step back and began to reorient the woman about where she was, who said what her name was, and tried to understanding that this might have been some kind of a flashback that the woman was experiencing. Once the woman was calmed down, it was indeed a flashback. The woman had been sexually abused by her father for years, and being startled like that caused a flashback. The officer and the woman then worked out a strategy for, should that happen again, a safer way to wake the woman up. Next slide. Next slide. So why does probation need to learn about trauma? Well, the Brownfield versus United States is the case of a Iraqi war veteran who, when he returned from the service, had engaged in the kinds of behaviors that you might typically see somebody suffering from PTSD. There was fighting, there was rage, road rage, there was a lot of drinking. In spite of this, his father was able, who works as a federal correction officer in Colorado, was able to get his son a job as a federal correction officer. But within a month of working and being employed at the correctional facility, he started smuggling in contraband cigarettes. Well, you can't do that in a jail or a prison. An officer can't do that. And so that actually was a felony with, according to federal sentencing guidelines, mandated a year and a day. So he had to go to prison. But probation did what probation does. They went in, they interviewed him, they found out his background, about his history, and were logically able to look at what it was that led up to that person's crime, and detailed very specifically that prior to military service, he had been a model student in high school. He hadn't had any issues early on in his military career, and it was only after his military career that he started to have his problems. They interviewed his family, who said this is not the same person. The war did not bring back the same person that left. And they put all that in their pre-sentence report. Next slide. And again. Next slide. So when the judge read the report, why do judges need to know about trauma? When the judge read that report that probation had so carefully written, the judge said, well, wait a minute. The federal sentencing guidelines didn't anticipate this set of facts. This is clearly the result of the man's military experience, and the judge ordered new pre-sentence and new psychological evaluations to confirm what the probation department had identified and suspected. Those evaluations came back, identified a diagnosis of PTSD, and Judge Kane from the Colorado Federal District Court wrote a several-page opinion about why he had to divert from the sentencing guidelines. So it's important across the justice system that people understand trauma and its impact on criminal behavior. Next slide. So those are some anecdotes about why it's important. But when we look at the prevalence of trauma of individuals involved in the justice system, you'll see why it really has to be considered as a factor in how the justice system addresses individuals with high prevalences of trauma. Now, this data here comes from 13 sites and over 2,000 individuals that participated in a jail diversion program that was funded by SAMHSA. And so this is a group of people with mental illness who participated in jail diversion programs. And what we found is lifetime prevalence for this group, this cohort of over 2,000 individuals, that for women, lifetime prevalence was 96% endorsed having had a traumatic event. There was no difference, really, no significant difference between men and women. Sometimes I think there's a myth that men and women in the justice system have vastly different rates. They don't. What surprised us most, though, was when we looked at what the current trauma levels were of the population. And current was defined as having had a traumatic event within 1 year of their incarceration. 74% of the women reported having a traumatic event. 86% of the men had reported having a traumatic event. The implication of this is that when we're initially engaging with somebody who's been who's in custody, and case managers understand this as much as anybody. It's not like we're trying to help people put their trauma in some perspective in the past. They are currently involved in unsafe environments. They're currently involved in unsafe relationships. And the very, very first task of case management very often, or for even treatment courts and for people who have worked in treatment courts extensively, is providing for the safety needs of that individual so that there's some kind of basis and foundation to move forward with treatment and further development and recovery. Next slide. I want to take a second to highlight the experience of justice-involved veterans. And this comes to us from, again, a group of individuals who participated in a veteran-specific jail diversion program that was SAMHSA funded. I think that a lot of the discussion about veterans is around combat trauma, and that when there's justice involvement, it's related to combat trauma if you're a veteran. However, the data that we developed from this program was that 95% of the cohort of people going through these programs had endorsed non-military trauma as an issue. And of that 95%, 73% had experienced trauma before the age of 18. So it's not just that we need to pay attention to military-related trauma. We really have to address what is very, very likely earlier trauma that may have exacerbated the PTSD or set the stage for the military-related trauma. Also, similar to the other cohort that we saw, a high degree endorsed that they had experienced trauma within the previous 12 months. So that, and the last data element here, 55% of the cohort did have some combat service. And of that group, 96% had experienced combat-related trauma. So there's a real nexus across both these populations between trauma and justice involvement. Next slide. And again, I think what's been overlooked often is the impact of racial inequities, disparities, and trauma. We know from data from a large number of studies that bail and pre-release disparities, that there's a higher prevalence of incarceration of Black and Hispanics in many populations. There's lower admission rates to drug courts. There's lower graduation rates. We found within our programs that there were disproportionately excluded from mental health programs also. Next slide. So if we're going to address trauma, and again, many justice systems are not routinely screening for trauma. And one of the things that we emphasized with the jail diversion programs that we oversaw was for really broad screening for trauma at admission to detention and correctional facilities. What many of the sites used at that time, it wasn't the primary care PTS screen for DSM-5, it related to DSM-4, but nevertheless, this was a 5-question screen which can be easily administered by healthcare professionals at booking to identify people who may be referred for further clinical assessment and treatment. It was developed by the National Center for PTSD, which is also a wonderful site for information around screening and assessment of trauma. Another valuable resource is something that the Gaines Center put out for SAMHSA, screening and assessment of co-occurring disorders. In the justice system, major author there is Roger Peters, a trauma expert and also co-occurring disorders expert. In the back of that monograph, there are appendices with a number of different screening and assessment instruments, not only for substance use and co-occurring disorders, but also for trauma. A very valuable resource. Next slide. To improve screening of veterans, the VA has developed, and again, if you're a jail and you haven't, you're not using this already, there's the Veterans Reentry Search Service. I know a number of communities are working very closely with their Veterans Justice Outreach Coordinator, and that's fine. But if there's a large number of veterans, the Veterans Reentry Search Service may be something you want to look at. What that is that the jail can get into the Department of Defense database and quickly match who in that database have served in the military, and quickly identify people who might need further assessment and screening as a veteran. Next slide. So in terms of response now to people with trauma, crisis intervention team training with which I think most of you are familiar with, is focused on law enforcement. And while it's not a trauma-specific program, it certainly has the same kinds of elements that you want to see with in terms of addressing trauma and having more of a trauma-informed system. The National Institute of Corrections have developed a crisis intervention team manual that can be downloaded for free and be utilized to train correction officers, not only covering diagnostic categories, but also, as in CIT training, de-escalation training and scenario response. So again, this could be a very helpful tool in helping your department become more trauma informed. Next slide. So what are some of the elements of trauma-informed jails? First of all, it's important to have a champion. Many communities, it is the superintendent who wants to improve responsiveness to people with trauma, understanding full well what the population is and what some of the main issues of the population are. A systemic review of policies and practices is important. So typically that has to do with looking at restraint policies, strip search policies, a number of different policies to see where there could be some balance between safety and more respectful ways of implementing correctional practices. We talked, that there be training on communications training. I've done a lot of training with police. I've done a lot of training with correction officers. The training that they're receiving generally in their academies or through post isn't sufficient to manage the complexity of the issues that they end up dealing with in their day-to-day jobs. And as in CIT training, communications training is an incredibly important component of having a trauma-informed jail. The trauma-informed training is a key area there, so that they're understanding, number one, the prevalence of the trauma that in the population, what some of the manifestations of trauma are among the population. So they may be seeing behavior that they might be considering obstructive or nonconformist kinds of behavior, where really it's trauma-based. And if they used a different approach, they would be able to de-escalate individuals sooner. We talked about the importance of screening by health staff, but then once that screening is been done and people have been identified, there's really are some very specific, trauma-specific treatments that generally are cognitive behavioral kinds of treatment that address trauma issues specifically. And you shouldn't assume that your mental health staff knows about these. They're generally manualized kinds of training. They take additional training besides what your mental health staff might be receiving. Another important component of that trauma-specific care is that people with lived experience be involved in providing that treatment also. So that, again, the barriers to engagement can be reduced by using people with lived experience. Next slide. If we're going to be training our staff about identifying trauma in the individuals that they're working with, it's important to pay attention to the psychological wellness, the emotional wellness and well-being of the officers that will be working with people. it's been a badly neglected area, because you really won't have a trauma-informed facility unless you're using the same kinds of principles in working at your staff, which can be a challenge of being a paramilitary kind of environment very often. Next slide. So, things to be aware of. This research shows that officers are exposed to violence at rates that are comparable to military veterans. So if you look at the rates of serious injury, feared injury or death, seeing or handling dead bodies, seeing someone seriously injured or killed, those rates are almost exactly equal. And we know that cumulatively these kinds of experience can result in post-traumatic stress and impaired job performance in their functioning within their families and socially. So they have very similar experiences to military veterans. Next slide. In addition, in a survey of correction officers, they found that the prevalence of suicidal ideation, so the graphic to the left on your screen, that among correctional officers in active duty, it's almost 3 times higher suicidal ideation than general population. For those that are retired, it's almost over 4 times higher. So again, the jobs that the correction officers have are very stressful and expose them to stress far higher than what occurs in the general population. Suicide rate is also high among correction officers. It's been documented that suicide rate among correction officers, and this is stunning when you stop and think about it, 39 times higher than the general population, and 2 times higher in a study in New Jersey. It was 2 times higher than law enforcement. I know when I worked in state corrections, there were years when the suicide rate of correction officers was higher than the suicide rates of inmates. When an inmate committed suicide, the world stopped. There was investigation, there were meetings to address and make the facility safer. Correction officer died by suicide, you only found out through a whisper stream. And there was no public acknowledgement of the correction officer's service. Next slide. So again, on for the Department of Justice, this document, Correctional Officer Wellness and Safety Literature Review, has a thorough review of the topic of officer wellness, and also a number of different programs and strategies to address it. But again, I urge you, if you're going to be undertaking any kind of trauma-informed approach in your facilities, not to overlook the correction officers. Next slide. I think that at this point, Lisa, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the courts.
Okay, I too have to make a mental note to unmute myself when I'm doing a webinar. Thank you, Dan. I think that it's worth repeating is at this point, and also we'll be doing in subsequent webinars, that one of the reasons we often put up the picture of the sim, as we're doing right here, is that it's important for us, for those who work in the system, to sort of position themselves where they are along these intercepts. Because everything that happens before you come into contact with someone in the justice system has an impact on how they're going to appear before you, and also how you send them on their way, whether it be to jail or to probation or parole. Also is significantly affected by the way your position in the intercepts also are responding to them. So we don't work in isolation. And so we want to, this is about trauma, being trauma informed across the sim. So The reason why we want to constantly reinforce this idea of the SIM is because everything that comes before has an impact on you and on the people who you are working with, and then subsequent to once someone leaves your custody or care, how you have responded to them has an impact as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus specifically on Intercept 3, and it is very intricately involved with the jail, because for people who are going to court, in many cases, if they haven't made bail or they haven't had a bail hearing yet, they're going to be going back and forth between court and jail. And so these two intercepts, as others, are very intricately involved. Next slide, please. I just want to plant some ideas in your mind at this point as I'm talking about becoming a trauma-informed court and why it's important. And these are just some questions for you to consider. I'm not asking for responses at this point, but we will at the end of our formal presentation. We will be asking for your questions and responses to these and others. You know, what if you have a goal, or your judge, for example, has given you sort of the marching orders to find out about becoming more trauma-informed in your court, what do you hope to gain from that? As I think it's important to emphasize, as Dan did, it's not just about being trauma-informed toward the defendants and others who you serve, but it's also important to be a truly trauma-informed court. You also have to incorporate an understanding of vicarious trauma and trauma that results from the work that people in the courts do. People hear and see and experience other people's trauma on a regular basis when you work in a court, and that's especially true if you work in a treatment court, because not only do you have people who are coming to you with significant trauma histories, but also you get to know them in a way that you might not if you're working in a traditional court. This isn't to say that traditional courts can't be nor shouldn't have a goal or strive to be more trauma-informed, but it's especially poignant for a treatment court to think about how trauma-informed they are for not only the defendants and participants, but also for co-workers and those who interface with the court. You could ask the question, is your courtroom set up in a trauma-informed way? And I'll give some examples in a bit. Do defendants, families, victims, witnesses, and staff feel safe? And that's not just their physical safety, but their emotional safety. Anyone who studies trauma, anybody who talks about trauma, know that you really can't make a dent in helping people if they don't feel safe. And for people who have significant trauma histories, they will go to great lengths to make sure that they are safe. And sometimes those actions or behaviors may seem extremely counterproductive in our minds, but in fact, they're strategies that have kept them safe up until this point. So it's important to know and to think about whether or not your courtroom and your offices make people feel or help people feel safe. The fourth bullet here, anybody who's attended court will often say they have no idea what's going on, what happened. They had no idea what anyone was saying, and all of a sudden a decision has been made. Can people in your court actually hear what the judge is saying, what the other officials are saying? Do you speak clearly? Do you speak slowly? Do you use common language, not a bunch of acronyms? Every profession has acronyms. One of the things we know for people who go to court, just walking through the courthouse door, going through the security screening, walking into that courtroom, which in many cases they're just awesome physical structures, it can be very intimidating. And they don't know what's going to happen to them, whether they're going to leave through the same door they just came in or leave through the door that's behind the judge. So it's important that courtrooms and judges and other court officials make sure that people who are participating can understand and hear what's going on. Next slide, please. So do you and other court staff show respect toward people, and how would you do that? Do you explain what's going on or what's to come next? Information is really key at becoming trauma-informed. It's not meaning giving away the farm, but just making sure that people know what happens next, or why someone might need to approach the bench, or why someone may need to speak to the bailiff or probation officer, or why the judge might call the attorneys up to the bench and speak in low voices. So it's really important to explain that to people, again, providing them with information. Is there a way to alter the courtroom setup just to be more trauma informed? Again, I'll give you some examples in a little bit. And how can you adapt your policies and procedures to become more trauma informed? I think it's really important to recall the not only the larger webinar that was done in March, but also the first webinar that we did as part of this learning community, is making sure that that we address not just the long-term policies and procedures that may need to be changed, that may even in fact be outside of the realm of our scope of influence, but what we can do ourselves and what our specific court can do. The reality of, in most courtrooms and in most communities, is judges have a lot of freedom to conduct their courtroom the way that they want to. We often read about judges who get into trouble because they've been disrespectful, that they have been not really regarded the families, the victims, the witnesses, the perpetrators in a respectful manner, and that often is what brings them to the maybe perhaps an ethics complaint. I don't know that I've ever read that a judge was brought before an ethics board because they were too respectful to people in the courtroom. So there's really no downside to being trauma informed or to setting up your courtroom and examining your procedures to make sure that you are not only causing primary trauma, but also re-traumatizing people who are in your courtroom. Next slide, please. I mentioned that treatment courts are really someplace that's probably the easiest place to start if you want to begin introducing specific trauma-informed practices into the courtroom. In many respects, unless the judges have somehow been put on the bench in a treatment court and have not wanted to, most judges, when asked about the work that they do with their treatment courts, will express that it's the most satisfying part of their job. It certainly, in most cases, requires the most time, requires the most patience, requires the most staff, because treatment courts have a lot of staff. But at the same time, so there's a lot that goes on, there's a lot that goes into it, but there's also a big payoff for people who work in treatment courts. So it's really a perfect first step, if you will, of introducing some trauma-informed practices into your courtroom, into your treatment court, and then see how it goes. Chances are that judge, unless you're in a really big community, really big jurisdiction, the judge that, for example, presides over an adult drug court probably has a regular dockets, regular set of dockets as well. And what we've also found from judges is that they have expressed that their awareness and they're really becoming more trauma informed in their treatment course spills over into the work that they do in their regular dockets too. That it isn't just for participants in drug court, but that, for example, showing respect to people who come before you, making sure people are safe, making sure that you can be heard, are all trauma-informed practices that carry over regardless of the type of court that it is. The reason I have this slide here is it's just, and this probably is a low count, but there are really thousands of treatment courts across the United States. And these are just adult treatment courts. There's many, many juvenile treatment courts as well. So there are thousands of opportunities across the country for courts led, by, of course, by the judge of that court to set as a priority introducing some number of trauma-informed practices so as to improve in many cases, the outcomes for their courtroom, and certainly improve the working environment of their courtroom. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a polling question, and what we would like to know is which of these treatment or problem-solving courts does your jurisdiction have? And you can check as many as apply to your jurisdiction. And these are all referring to adult treatment courts. So if you would just quickly, oh, I take that back. There's one down there that says juvenile treatment court. But if you would just quickly check the boxes that apply, and then the magic of the polling on Zoom will give us the outcomes. Okay. I think I'm supposed to see the results, but I don't see them right now. There we go. I don't think it would surprise any of us to learn that just about all of the jurisdictions that are represented on the webinar here today have an adult treatment court, adult drug court. In fact, almost all counties in the United States have access to an adult drug court. This is not the case with mental health courts. There are many, many, many fewer mental health courts. I'm glad to see that 2/3 of you have a mental health court in your jurisdiction. And those are the most common adult treatment courts. And they're also, especially the mental health courts, or the specific types of treatment courts where you probably are going to have ample time and access to more resources to refer people to trauma-specific clinical services, as Dan was saying, that there are specific clinical interventions that are tailored for justice-involved individuals and specifically address their trauma. And in many cases, because of the clinicians that are often affiliated with a mental health court that a drug court may not have the same access, mental health courts are really in a perfect position to make sure that their practices are trauma-informed. Next slide, please. I just like this slide. In my next life, I'm coming back as a judge because people take your calls and return your calls and listen to you all the time. They may not do what the judge says, but they listen. But of course, I'd have to finish law school if I was going to become a judge. So that's just really an indication of who that leadership role needs to be seated with the judge, or someone who the judge designates as being his or her champion of becoming a trauma-informed court. Next slide, please. Okay. Some people object to using the word leverage when it comes to treatment courts, but the fact of the matter is that that's what treatment courts do. Because they are, by definition, voluntary, something has to be offered as an alternative to treatment as usual, or you're having your justice disposition be as it typically would be. And this is especially true when you're talking about individuals facing relatively low charges, because as more and more communities are not incarcerating people for low-level offenses, they're getting an appearance ticket. There needs to be some kind of leverage, meaningful leverage, presented to people in order to get them to participate in a treatment court. And this applies also to their public defender, because the public defender often is overworked. Hopefully they're well informed about what a treatment court is. And I would hope that they're in their jurisdiction, that they do specialize, and that the public defenders work in all of the treatment courts, or if it's a large enough jurisdiction, are just assigned to, say, the mental health court or the drug court. But there are a number of ways in which the prosecutor, the judge, and the public defender can work with the defendant to introduce treatment as leverage. And this can happen whether it's at the pre-plea stage, and that would be those almost not quite an Intercept 3 intervention. This could even be offered as a form of diversion by the prosecutor and the public defender, diverting someone into services. Sometimes it's with the caveat that if they complete treatment, their charges will be dismissed. And that is, for example, in the state of New York, we have now what are called opioid courts. And those are all pre-plea courts, that if people agree to treatment for up to the period of time that is recommended and they complete treatment, then their charges are dismissed and and the record is expunged. So in fact, that crime goes away entirely, other than, social media, nothing goes away entirely. Post-plea leverage is where a sentence might be modified, it might be deferred. Often it's treatment court. But this is, treatment courts are usually post-plea. But what they usually negotiate with the participant and the public defender about is treatment rather than incarceration. That's usually what the leverage is that someone will agree to go into community-based treatment. They'll complete their treatment. The court will supervise them. They'll report on a regular basis to the court that they've attended their meetings, they've attended their appointments, they've stayed out of trouble, etc. And then they may not have their charges dismissed or their record expunged, but they at least were able to not go into a jail or prison. And then there we go. So another type of leverage is around probation. And that's the way some drug courts specifically phrase their drug court, that it's a probation-based supervision of individuals. They're convicted, they plead guilty in most cases, and their probation is connected to their treatment. So I would like to just put out there that it's this, especially the second and the third option here, they really blend in together in many cases. These are not neat and tidy distinctions. Sometimes it really varies from defendant to defendant, from charge to charge, from even prosecutor to prosecutor, the way in which, whether something is actually in practice post-plea or probation-based court disposition. Next slide, please. So and we're going to talk about some of the more practical ways in which you can think about making your court more trauma informed. But these are some really important considerations that the courts need to, I would argue, consciously and intentionally consider when they think about the consequences of, for example, whether they're going to enter into a program that's pre-plea and then expunges the person's record, or one that carries with it a conviction and carries with it all the consequences of a conviction, but and as well as getting the treatment. But there really are some profound consequences. We know that employment is very difficult for people who have a criminal conviction. Some states have a initiative, Ban the Box, where you can't ask somebody on a job application whether or not they've been convicted of a crime. There are so many reasons why people cannot get into safe housing, suitable housing, that have nothing to do with being convicted of a crime or being arrested, but that just adds to it. Housing is just in profound shortage in every community across the United States, and it is especially a scarce commodity for people who have a conviction. So again, judges and courts need to consider this. And it may not really have an impact on the way in which your program operates, in the sense of people showing up to court, people being supervised, the right and the rights of the judge to pull somebody back in if they haven't shown up, whether they're violating in terms of the court. But really thinking about whether or not going the full conviction route is worth the consequences. And some might say collateral consequences. I think they're primary consequences to a criminal conviction, regardless of whether it's part of a drug court or not. Identification is a huge issue. Many people don't have driver's licenses. Many people don't have identification. If they've been in jail for any period of time, chances are they don't. So programs, that being a really important part of your treatment court, for example, is working with people to be able to get identification. Any kind of indebtedness, student debt, other kind of loan debt. A lot of people who become arrested and get involved in the justice system have domestic debts from especially around child support. Some law clinics work specifically with defendants to help them reduce their debt or address their debt. And the entitlements. We talk a lot about this in the work that we do. The kinds of consequences of, let's say, a sanction for someone who has violated the terms of your treatment court, and even if it's a big lapse, if they're in the jail for more than 30 days, they're going to lose a lot of their entitlements. So and this is especially true in communities that terminate rather than suspend entitlements. But 30 days, or it might even be 28 days, Dan, I'm sure knows the answer to this, is a magic number. So making sure that your judge understands that consequence. If someone has failed a number of drug tests, for example, what is it going to mean for their ability to access treatment when after they serve their sanction in jail? If they no longer have medical insurance, if they no longer have housing, then we're really putting them back many, many further months, if not years behind, than just the length of time that they served their sanction in the jail. So making sure that the consequences to your sanctions, consequences to the structure of your program are really clearly understood, and you discuss all of them and make a conscious decision that it's more important for us to have this sanction attached to this lapse than it is for someone to remain in suitable housing. Because those are the trade-offs. We might not like to talk about it that way, but that's what happens. People lose housing, they lose medical insurance, and they lose other entitlements depending upon what our response is to them. Doesn't mean there aren't responses. We just need to know what the consequences are. Next slide, please. Going back to that, again, that visual I want you to keep in mind is that there are many, at each point where you go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc., there are going to be cross-intercept gaps. And this is where it's really important for you in becoming, people falling through the cracks. It leads to a lot of really unfortunate situations. People with mental health and substance use disorders, it usually means they become severed from treatment. They get their case manager can't find them. In some cases, their probation officer may not be able to find them either. Not that they're hiding from them, but perhaps they don't have anywhere to live. So to the extent that you can make plans and coordinate and communicate across all of these intercepts, you are going to have a smoother transition, and it is consequently going to be less stressful, less traumatic for the people who are in your programs if, in fact, the jail is talking to the court and the court is talking to the jail. In many jurisdictions, for example, the sheriff is responsible for the jail and is responsible for transporting people to court. So depending upon how that ride went or that escort went is going to have a profound impact on how that person appears before you as the judge. If it was a trauma-informed process, the person is going to be in much better shape to be able to even hear what the judge has to say than if it's really one that really isn't taking into consideration the fear and anxiety and other stresses that the individual might be experiencing. So the more you can communicate and coordinate. One example I like to give is one of the sheriffs that we've done some work with over the years. He trained all of his transportation officers in motivational interviewing. That way, he said that people came from court to jail in much better shape than they would have been without it, and vice versa. The people that his men and women transported to court arrived in a much better situation, a much better place mentally and emotionally when their transportation officers knew how to talk to people, knew how to implement the strategies of motivational interviewing with the individuals they were charged with transporting. Sharing information and data. If I were in a room right now and talking with you, I'd probably walk over to the wall and start banging my head against it, because just think about that being just virtually, I'm doing that. There is such a resistance across the intercepts to share information and data. And not doing that causes gaps, it causes hiccups. It, in some cases, can just exacerbate situations. The concerns around privacy and HIPAA can all legally be surmounted with the appropriate technical assistance. Cross-training, what we're doing right now, making sure that not only in your part of the SIM uses evidence-based practices, but as Dan mentioned, if you're referring people out to treatment, if you're doing screening and assessment, you want to make sure that the programs that you are referring them to that are part of your program, that are in the community, are evidence-based. And you want to make sure that they have appropriate trauma-informed training, that they specifically understand that it's different than other kinds of trainings that they might have. And as the judge or as the judge's spokesperson, you have a lot of leverage with the providers. You can say, you know, we're working on becoming trauma-informed, we're doing screening and assessment, and we're working with all of our partners at the jail. But in order for me to refer people in my mental health court, my drug court, my family court, to your programs, I need to make sure that you have people who are trained in trauma-specific treatments. And so there's a way that judges can use their own, that power that they have, the authority that they have to make sure that the care and the trauma-informed care is continuous. Next slide, please. Dan mentioned that making sure that you have cross-system screening for military service. There are specific ways to ask whether someone is a veteran, and there are specific programs that are available to people who have been in the U.S. military. So getting to know that and knowing the kinds of information that you should have. Dan mentioned your veteran justice outreach person. Every VA in the United States has between 1 and 4 VJOs attached to them. They should be your partner. You should know who they are, and at any point in time, if you believe you have a veteran in your program, you call them, you have them go visit that person and find out whether or not they're a veteran. That then allows them to have access to services that you may not be able to provide. That doesn't mean they're removed from your court or that they have to go into Veterans Treatment Court. It just means there's additional services that they would be eligible for, including housing. There are housing that veterans are eligible for that others are not. Making sure that your health care is integrated. We know that people who have experienced trauma, whether it be recently or in their past, have much worse health outcomes. So people in your programs that have a lot of health problems, it should be a red flag for you in terms of they may have a trauma history that maybe they're working on in treatment, maybe they're not, maybe they don't even recognize it as something that can be addressed. But if you have people who have lots of health problems in your programs, which I'm sure you do, you should really be paying close attention to that and having them screened and assessed for trauma. Dan also mentioned peer services. Can't say that enough. In order for you to, for people to be successful in your program, they have to trust you and they have to feel safe. And often the best ambassador for your program are peers. Peers that have either been specially trained to work with your program, but have not been part of it, but even better, people who have been part of your program, who have graduated or have transitioned out of your program, can be your best ambassador, provide the best information for people who are just entering your program. I mentioned this already, housing is a huge problem. Making sure that we understand the consequences to housing for people who are in our programs. Transportation, can people actually show up? Well, right now with COVID, people aren't showing up at all anyway, but transportation is a huge barrier for people, especially in rural areas. But even in areas with public transportation, in some cases, there's no relationship between the public transportation and the public courts. Something I don't really understand, because it seems to me it comes out of the same budget, big budget, but for some reason, the courts sometimes don't have access to vouchers, for example, for people to use public transportation. And working with employers. Imagine an employer who you can say to him or her, you know, we'll do all the drug testing. We'll make sure this person is, you know, crossing all their T's and dotting all their I's. Give them a chance. We'll be the bad guy. We'll make sure they show up for work every day. We'll make sure that they're drug-free. We'll make sure that they're alcohol-free. Treatment programs, drug courts, mental health courts can do that and can really make that appeal to employers that you're the supervisor, even outside of the 8 or so hours that they're employed. And lastly, here is data. That kind of goes back to the second point I made on the other slide, but making sure that you know what data you have access to, what data you need, and making sure that you use the data to demonstrate either where your gaps are or where you're doing a really great job. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I passed the baton now to Ethan, if I remember correctly.
Correct. Thank you, Dan and Lisa, for that presentation. Just wanted to remind people that if you do have questions, you can chat them in down at the bottom of your screen in the chat box. And I think looking at the time that we have left, I was hoping to structure the discussion piece in a couple different ways. First, I do want to turn back to the content and potentially maybe, Allison, maybe we can go back to the couple slides in the beginning of Lisa's presentation, what to consider. Had some questions up that I know Lisa wanted to go back to. And so I was thinking that maybe we can start back at some of these questions and go around the room and see if, who has some answers or some suggestions here.
Sure, Ethan, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I actually, put them also a little bit later in the deck so that it's repeated. So let me try to, sorry, the slide turning is a little bit fussy today. Let me try to advance it. And I also just modified, these are the same questions, but because I knew we were going to be covering both intercepts, I just sort of added in, jails and courts so that we would have both those considerations in there.
Perfect. So certainly wanted to open it up to the group in terms of what do people hope to gain by being in trauma-informed jail or court, and certainly thinking about the content that was presented here today. And also to sort of encourage that this is also an opportunity, being a learning community, that other grantees and grant teams get to learn about what other jurisdictions are doing for practices. I've heard from grantees that I work with that that's just very, very valuable to them. So I want to encourage that.
This is Lisa Callahan. I would love to hear what some of the communities are doing. And again, they don't need to be broad, big policy changes, but some things that maybe they've learned in the process of whether it be in their jail or in their court, some changes they've made that they believe is making them a more trauma-informed, whether it's a court or a jail. I would just love to hear some examples.
This is Charity from Chatham County. We have had a big initiative to have not only CIT trained police officers in the county and the community, but also have ECIT trained officers, which I believe has made a big difference. And COVID has set us back a little bit, but we did right before start having a behavioral health unit. So we have a trained ECIT officer with a mental health provider being dispatched to a scene when it is dealing with a mental illness or a mental health issue. And that seems to be helping a lot with bringing in people being booked in the jail with mental health. So we're still working on getting resources more in the community and the data sharing with the community's providers and stuff. But that has been a key thing for us here that I've seen a big difference in.
Charity, one of the things, this is Lisa, one of the things you may want to do, and it goes back to the data piece, is kind of brainstorm with the people who are part of that program and find out where you think the benefits are beyond just, say, at the time of booking. It may be that there are fewer EMT calls. There may be fewer calls to the emergency department or transportation, transporting someone to the emergency department, because they then can become your allies in demonstrating why these resources are well spent in people being able to go to jail to be booked versus going into the emergency department because it's escalated into something more than what it needed to be. So sometimes we think of our allies as being the real obvious ones, right? But sometimes the systems you can most affect by those kinds of community-based interventions are the more, all those allied stakeholders out there. You're making their life easier, okay? And I think it might be worth, whether you can collect data on that or just have someone have a conversation with them and have them speak on your behalf, I think might be very beneficial.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
So I just want to follow up. You're absolutely right, Lisa, about collecting the data. I noticed in the grantee descriptions that were provided that a number of the sites are really focused on law enforcement-based interventions. And so I just want to reiterate the point I made about the officer wellness issues with correction officers, because the same holds true with police officers. And if you're just in law enforcement, if you're just starting your CIT initiatives, we just finished a rather large program with BJA, training a number of communities on to help them develop a CIT program. And we included that they simultaneously prepare for an officer wellness companion program, because the issue is going to come up. If you're doing co-response teams, the officer and the clinician, they're going to start talking. The officer is going to say to that person, you know, one of the officers I work with, he's not doing so well. What do you think? Or maybe it'll be more personal for the officer. And they're not going to use the generic system. There needs to be some really good discussion about what the best resources are for your officer staff. And they need to be aware of the impact of the work that they do and even trauma on their own lives. So it would be important to, as you're developing your CIT programs or expanding them, and there's a number of resources that we can provide you if people are interested. BJA has a number. To begin to develop that, because it's going to be a major issue moving forward. And as a team, you want to be prepared.
Thank you.
Are there any other examples of some maybe even small tweaks that you've made in your programs or in even the physical settings that you think makes it more trauma informed?
I was gonna just share what it's Intercept 01, our project is, but we're working with the Denver PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point, which is 911. And one of the things that they did related to their call takers was when there was like critical incidents, they bring in somebody who has trauma training to talk to their staff, and they make everybody, supervisors included, go in and spend a specified amount of time talking to them so that there's not that stigma involved. So you can go in the room, not say anything if you don't think you need to talk to them, but everybody has to at least go in the room. And I thought that was a very creative way to try and do wellness with your employees.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great example, Peggy, of the kinds of interventions that you can have that are preventative also.
Do any of you have treatment court judges who don't wear a robe and perhaps don't even sit up on the big high bench, but sit down at the defendant or prosecutor's table with the participants? Has anybody seen a court operate that way? Because that's an easy fix. That's a quick fix if your judge would be open to that, trying that. It's not uncommon in the treatment court world for the judge to mix up the physical environment a little bit. And if you think about especially in mental health courts, to a somewhat lesser extent in drug courts, most of the defendants have been in court a lot. And so it signals to them too that things are different when it's not structured in the same way that it is in a traditional court that they're familiar with. Something else, this is something that I often, if you've heard me say this before, I apologize. But I was so impressed with the Pueblo, Colorado mental health court. It was part of a grant program that the Gain Center was the TA provider for. And so I had the great opportunity to be able to sit through sessions in most of the treatment courts that were part of the grant program. And what they do in the Pueblo court, and I'm told they still do this, is the judge, the prosecutor, the public defender, the probation officer, the court coordinator, and the provider, the main representative of the provider, each time the participants steps forward for their hearing, each one of those officials turns to the individual and speaks to him or her by name, Mr. Jones, and will say something to that individual that he or she has done that week that's been really great. And it's so affirming. I mean, it's really quite emotional, to be honest with you. Again, this is free. This doesn't cost any money. It doesn't require a change in policy or procedure. It's a style and a manner and a way of opening the court that affirms the person's participation. It affirms their humanity. For many of them, that hasn't happened very often, and certainly not in situations of authority. And it's really quite moving. And it doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be you made 100% of your appointments this week. It can be you made it to 75% of your treatment appointments this week. That's great. Or I heard that you got, that you were able to finish your community service this week. But every single member of the team addresses each participant, and it's really, really moving. And I would like to see more courts do that. But anyway, that was just an example of something that's free, something that can be done. It requires buy-in, obviously, from the whole team. But it's really quite gratifying to see the look on the faces of these individuals for whom they have not received much affirmation in many parts of their lives.
I have a question, and maybe Lisa, you might be able to answer it. This is Charity again. So when people, and I'm new to this position, but when people violate their drug court or mental health court, they're brought here to the jail to be held for 72 hours or whatever it is. Is that common? Or, because, I see like that's very much re-traumatizing somebody or making them feel as though they're a criminal because they violated their, whatever it is that they violated, versus maybe finding a place for them to be on like house arrest or something like that. So I didn't know if that was a common thing or something that we're doing here, so that maybe that's something I can look down the line to see if it can get changed.
I would, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would say it was more common. I would say it's less common now for a variety of reasons. Certainly the reason you suggested, because it is re-traumatizing, is one. Another, and this may be the way to convince the naysayers about that, is then what do you have left? You've gone to, you've used jail, you've used your, you've just used your ACE card, right? And ultimately you're trying to model, ways to make people accountable that doesn't require the ultimate punishment of being transported back to jail. And I guess I would also suggest, going back to those questions to consider, what are the consequences of that sanction, and are they necessary? Weighing those consequences. So jail is not used as a sanction all that much anymore. Most judges I've seen will tie themselves into knots before they'll use jail as a sanction. Obviously if someone reoffends, that's a different issue altogether. But if it's a violation, you've just gone, you've used the big one. So that may be a way to, sort of making people more accountable, and using incremental sanctions so that hopefully you can find something less extreme that's just as effective. It gets the person's attention, but it isn't going to have all those other consequences and re-traumatize them.
Thank you.
Lisa, I just wanted to follow up. We had a comment from John from Lubbock regarding their judge and being very personal and walking directly up to participants, and just wanted to follow up with John if there's anything more you wanted to add there. Give you the opportunity.
John or me? Were you?
Oh, I was asking John, who had posted the comment. Okay, So what else I wanted to say on that, just to follow up on John's comment, and we'll try to get this out in some resources in between that we'll put together for people, is Trauma Informed Oregon, which was a state initiative, and they did a lot of work with their courts, and they clearly had some money in a budget to do some more cosmetic makeover to the courtroom to make it more trauma informed. But I think they do talk a lot about interactions and how that really is where the trauma informed work lies, is our interactions with people.
And that's a real hard thing to measure. And it's a hard thing to, for some judges, it's a big step to let go of the structures that make a courtroom a courtroom. But typically when judges become confident enough in that, ultimately it is a courtroom, and it is their courtroom. You can dress it up and make it look like something that it's not, but ultimately we know who in the room has the authority. And I think that's trying a couple of those changes. And I think most judges would say they interact differently with people in their treatment court. They know their name. I mean, that alone is something that's different than in a typical criminal court procedure.
So I have a question for specifically, I think I'll have the names right, Faye and Nima from Fort Bend, and then Dina from LaForge County in Louisiana. There appear to be jail-based programs that you're using your grant funds for. So I'm interested in knowing whether or not there's a trauma-informed component to the expansion of the programs that you're developing.
Hi, this is Dina from LaFouche Parish. So I actually am sort of new to the team, and in me being brought on to the sheriff's office, my background is mental health. I'm a psychologist. So the goal is to start to implement some of those things. One of the things that we're doing with our grant is we are doing CIT with patrol, but we're also doing a corrections-based focused CIT, but COVID has kind of gotten into the way of that.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to really do trainings in the last couple of months, but what we are getting ready to do is start to do some collaboration with other stakeholders in the community. So the district attorney in our jurisdiction actually reached out to me. So what I'm going to do is going to kind of talk about some of our ideas and our visions moving forward. Our district attorney is really motivated about making sure that the assistant district attorneys are aware of mental health related issues and trauma informed issues. So it's a small step, but it's a first step. And so with that being said, we're trying just to make sure that we have an open line of communication. We don't have a mental health court in our jurisdiction, but ultimately, hopefully, with being able to collaborate with stakeholders like the district attorney, and perhaps the next step of some of the judges bringing them into the fold and into the conversation, we can move toward that direction.
Well, I think first steps are great, right? Because that's, and it's good to have that topic on your agenda moving forward so you can build and expand. One suggestion is that document that I referenced earlier in the presentation, screening and assessment of co-occurring disorders in the criminal justice system. again, it's free off the SAMHSA website. It might be a very helpful tool for you in terms of developing your program and expanding your program, picking out what screening tools are most relevant for your setting, and what assessment tools might be helpful also.
This is Allison from the Justice Center. I just say also it's just great to hear that the prosecutor in your jurisdiction is, you know, reaching out to you and just involved. That might be somebody that is a champion for the efforts, right? So I know that so it's great to build that relationship. We also have some, if you're interested, we also have some prosecutor related resources we could send out to you. There are, and this is would be a big undertaking, but there are prosecutor-led diversion resources out there. So down the line, if he is that interested, he might be interested in looking through those and seeing if that's something that would be a fit. But there's also, you know, other court-related, even I'm thinking of some of the JPLI resources, the Judges and Psychiatrists Leadership Initiative resources that we have that are around best practices, and they may not be exclusively about trauma-informed approaches, but that's certainly included throughout, so that might be something of interest to you as well.
Definitely any resources that you have, the prosecutor resources, that's something that would be helpful now, absolutely.
Yeah, there's the American Prosecutors Association has, they relatively recently released a prosecutor-led diversion toolkit. So we can send you the link to that, but if you Google it, it'll probably come right up too if you really want to get it quickly, but we'll include that on the list too. Yeah, so that's a really interesting, you know, resource to send to the DA.
Okay. Thank you.
Sometimes, I don't know if you all agree, sometimes, you know, also, I think if you have judges that maybe, you know, and it's a reality, sometimes judges don't necessarily want to change things, or they're not 100% convinced yet about changing things in a courtroom, or a person overseeing a jail for that matter too. And sometimes they want to speak to, sometimes that person would be willing to speak to someone else in their same discipline. So that's another thing we encourage you to raise with us, to raise with your TA coach as well, because we definitely have plenty of other judges that are currently using some of these practices in their courts that may have been naysayers earlier, you know, and they've made the switch. But, you know, sometimes a judge likes to speak with a judge, or a sheriff likes to speak with a sheriff if they're overseeing the jail. And, you know, sometimes that's an interesting conversation. Just setting that up can sometimes open doors too.
This is Faye over here at Fort Bend County. So some of the things that we do have implemented, we have a mental health roundtable that we have with the different judges and the court coordinators. We have people from the jail come over for that, also the local mental health authorities, and we kind of keep conversation going between the different areas that often work together with this population. We have our CIT trainings that we do. We actually have one coming up next week for our officers. And for the jail piece, for the project, we're going to try and focus a lot on jail diversion and when getting them out of jail, what kind of resources do they need, what kind of things that we do, and taking a look at our population in the jail. And I think right now it's a pretty high population for our mental health individuals in the jail, and trying to figure out why that is and helping get them the treatment that they need. And we work closely with a couple of our officers there. So there are a lot of room for improvement in terms of the trauma-informed care, but we are keeping the conversation open between all different departments.
So again, you know, SAMHSA has a number of, and we'll provide them to our friends at the Justice Center to send out around trauma-informed care as it relates specifically to correctional institutions. One of the big sells on this, and I didn't have it on my slide, is that there are published studies that show following trauma-informed care treatment in correctional facilities that the rates of physical violence goes down between UIs between staff and inmates, that there's a release of inter-offender violence, there's a reduction in inter-offender violence also. So it can help make the facility safer for everybody involved. So they're really, and again, CIT training is great, but it's really focusing on the trauma issues and the communication issues that go with having a trauma-informed facility can be helpful. The other issue around mental illness and substance use, we always talk about co-occurring disorders, but if trauma isn't central to that conversation, you're really talking about tri-occurring disorders, because trauma is often the pilot light that's fueling the substance use. You can't address the substance use unless you deal with the underlying trauma. And although, and the same can be true for mental illness. Certainly mental illness can have a biological base, but also it's either exacerbated by trauma or actually was precipitated by a trauma. So you really have to be able to, in a very targeted way, address that trauma. So we can provide you with some resources to build into your program.
I just wanted to follow up with one question for Faye. You mentioned you had a CIT training scheduled. I was curious if that was being done virtually or in person. I have some grantees that have been find it challenging, have CIT and grant, and just had some challenges around how to deliver that, and given what the circumstances are.
So we're doing them in person so we had our first one start in June, and that was a cadet class that we had. So it was there was only about like 20 of them, and it was in our big hall. So they all had hand sanitizers and they wore their masks. Then we had another one in June, and normally we have about 40 people per class, but right now it's about.
You just went on mute.
I don't know how I did that. And we're doing, they're all just required to wear their masks. And so I generally assist with the scenarios. So even I'll wear my mask during scenarios, and I am dripping in sweat and thirsty the entire time, but we're making it work, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Not a problem.
So we want to go on to the next slide.
One second, the slides seem to be sticking a little. Let me get them. There we go. These are some of the, earlier questions from Lisa, just the ones that I put them on 2 slides. We could also continue on to I have the slides that you also put together, Ethan.
Sure. Yep.
Do you want me to keep going, or?
Yeah, next slide, please.
Okay.
So some other discussion questions, I think, and I know we've touched on a lot of this, but, thinking about how do organizations create structures to support a trauma-informed approach. I think as we started this, I know Dr. Callahan has talked about that it's really, when you're looking at an organization that's being trauma-informed, it's from the very top at the CEO all the way down to those who perform maintenance operations. It's not just the staff who provide the direct care. And I think that's a really important concept to consider as an organization. And so curious out there for folks who have done this or have other examples of how organizations have tried to create some of that.
So this is Michelle Bang with Omaha Police Department. So as I've been sitting here and listening, obviously we are at the first Intercept in law enforcement, and we're talking about jails and courts, but I'm thinking about how our own facilities are set up specifically as it relates to adult witnesses and suspects themselves in interview rooms, and our training and how we're taught, as opposed to, you know, what you're now describing as far as setting up these rooms and how our officers sit with them. Is there any literature on that component of it, just even in the physical setup of the room? Because we do have some trauma-informed training. We've done quite a bit of it, especially as it relates to our victims and witnesses. And that, it's FETI training. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. But that, I was just wondering if you had anything about that.
That's a great question.
So I'm not aware of any. Dan, have you, with all the work you've done with CIT and CIT International, have you run across anything like that?
Not that comes immediately to mind. Although it's not a new conversation to me when, you know, in talking about trauma and trauma systems, and to look at. I'm glad you bring it up, you know, because a lot of our work is focused on offenders, but then there's a whole other issue with victims, and you hear an awful lot in this work about how victims are traumatized, and that those experiences aren't necessarily incorporated into how they're treated as as they also go through various aspects of the criminal justice system. So I don't know offhand of resources, but it's not a new conversation. I wouldn't be surprised if it would be pretty easy to locate some.
Well, in effect, where our victims and our suspects are interviewed, it's a very similar room. It's a stark room. It's a table, 2 chairs. It's meant to place the suspect at a level of discomfort.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's the read technique, those types of things. That's how we're trained in order to, you know, elicit. And today's victim is often tomorrow's suspect, let's be honest. Often
that's true.
they are in the same pool, or they're, you know, so any which way, I didn't know if there's any new best practices as it relates to, again, that intercept. You're talking about training, so I was thinking about what Lisa said related to training the transportation officers on motivational interviewing. Well, that could be important to train our uniformed patrol officers on how that interaction sets up the success of the later interviews with them, be it a victim, be it a witness, be it a suspect. So if, you know, me as a criminal investigator, I always want that to be the most professional, most, you know, to get them ready and prepared to be able to talk to me. I guess that was a very long-winded way to say that. So.
Well, Michelle, I think that's a great observation that you have, though, right? In terms of environment, because environment's an important part of whether somebody feels intimidated or not. How those questions get asked is important regarding how, if it comes across as more of interrogation as opposed to an elicitation of events. It's a very subtle difference, but nevertheless, it can dramatically change the experience for somebody who's been a crime victim. And I think those are the kinds of conversations you want to have internally. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if there are resources available. I just haven't come across any.
This is Allison, Dan. I was thinking as you all were talking, you know, I'm not an investigator, so I certainly cannot advise on, you know, how you would want to approach your investigative, you know, techniques. But I mean, I think, yeah, I agree. I think just recognizing it to start with is really important, that you understand the difference in the atmosphere that's created. And so I think there is some literature that might be related. It's slightly different topics. So there's you know, some literature, some resources that I know of more in the field of gender responsive services for women, which of course really includes being trauma informed as well, but it's geared more towards women in particular, and response to women. So there's an instrument, now it's an acronym that I have to hopefully remember correctly, but there's an instrument out there called the GRIPA. It's a policy and practice self-assessment instrument. It stands for gender responsive. I think actually that's what it stands for, gender responsive policy and practice assessment, if I'm not mistaken, and it's free. It's an instrument that a team or an agency can use to take a look at their program or their department or their team and see how gender responsive they're being in terms of their practices and their policies. And it's divided up into sort of sections, and one section is the physical environment, so facilities, et cetera. And so that might be something to take a look at just to get some ideas, although I know you're not only working with women, but you might just get ideas on being more responsive, being more trauma informed that way by looking at that. We can send that out. And we also did, again, we have a separate learning community on gender responsive services for women. So that's how I happen to know of these, but we did a webinar in that learning community, I think it was just last year, where we actually had some guest speakers who were grantees, we had a sheriff and the behavioral health lead. So they were JMHCP grantees, and they were, they had the behavioral health authority and also the sheriff who oversaw the jail. And again, it's not your police department offices, but they spent a lot of time on the webinar discussing, they had the opportunity to build a new women's facility, a new women's jail. And the sheriff was fascinating discussion because he had spoken with and visited other facilities. This was obviously pre-COVID, but he had visited other facilities around the country, including ones that had, specific gender responsive units for women. And he talked a lot during that webinar about why he made certain choices in the design of the rooms and even the decorations. So obviously, I know you're not at the point where I don't think where you're building new rooms, but even the design of the units, where the chairs were placed, to make it more welcoming or not, under the circumstances when you as an investigator might want to make it more welcoming and less stressful. So those are a couple of resources that, if you're interested in, we can send out to you. You can take a look and see if any of those strategies might apply to your circumstances.
Thank you.
Yep, just saw a question come in from Peggy. Yes, that resource will be going out. We'll make sure that you have that resource. It is linked here in the document, and we'll make sure, or in the PowerPoint, we'll make sure that teams get that assessment instrument.
Something I want to add too, if I could, this is Lisa. One of the things that we do a lot of trauma training, and I've mentioned that in the past across the justice system, and we're often asked to recommend screening and assessment instruments, and we always have in our resources, I mean, they're all evidence-based. They've all been validated with the justice populations, et cetera. But we also are very cognizant of wanting to recommend, and I think Allison, you might have said this, or Dan said this, that instruments that are available free of charge, because there are excellent evidence-based screening and assessment tools on trauma and other conditions, but specifically on trauma, that you don't need to spend any money to get them, other than to decide whether you're going to do them by paper or put them up on as part of your intake. But in fact, most of the screening instruments too don't require a clinician to administer them. The assessments do, but the screening tools are generally intended for someone at the first contact, someone like the booking sergeant or the first mental health person who goes and meets somebody and starts to do a health assessment at the jail, or in the court, it can be a court coordinator, or it can be the social worker in the court. It doesn't have to be a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist who does these initial tools. And I think, and you also don't need to spend money to do it. So these are fairly easy like first steps to introduce to see what the extent of the issues are in your particular facility. And there are some that are used that we've done trainings in many places on this, and some we would discourage you from using, because sometimes, usually the reason is the intent isn't to do what it's being used for. So we're happy to answer any questions around that too. The monograph that Dan referred to, the screening and assessment monograph for co-occurring disorders, which is on Roger Peters' document that's on SAMHSA website, has all of the metrics, all of the information you need to know about any of the screening and assessment tools and interventions focusing on trauma. But one caution I would give before you push the print button, I believe the latest version of that document is over 300 pages long.
Yeah.
So you may want to keep an electronic version of that handy and only print the pages that you really need to. It's a phenomenal document and big.
And Lisa, it's going up now on the chat.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, and again, we'll make sure it is sent out to everyone. So go ahead, Dina, if you wanted to ask your follow-up question.
Yes, I was just wondering, when Faye spoke about how they are kind of adjusting to COVID with their CIT trainings with less people, what are you guys doing about the site visits? So how are you able to kind of like, do social distancing and, find sites for the participants to be able to go to? Has that been a challenge at all?
So the only part that I'm actually aware of, so I know we'll have our speakers and everyone come out for the trainings to the academy to do the speakers, I know, and then for the role-playing scenarios, we'll go over to the academy and we'll split up into rooms. But in terms of anything else, that is up to the officers on how they do it, and I'm not 100% sure about that part.
Okay.
I haven't heard anything about CIT switching away or changing and doing a virtual. This is Allison from the Justice Center. I don't know, Dan and Lisa, if you have. I have not heard anything about them choosing to switch yet to a virtual protocol for CIT. CIT International, I don't think they're doing that as far as I know.
Yeah, I don't believe CIT International is. I think some have heard talk of some communities thinking about it, but I don't know that any that have actually developed it in regard to the question that recently on the table. Rather than do the site visits, what they did decide to do was bring the providers in, and they didn't actually go out to the sites for just the precaution reasons. But that, again, that they used large space if they were going to do the de-escalation training. And it's just, a handful, just really a few that I've heard trying to get a program up and running during this COVID issue.
Thank you. Just looking at our time, I did want to just move to our learning community exercises. And I think this is what I'd like to do to shorten it a little bit on exercise 2. So if there was, if a grantee does have a specific example that they'd like to share, a policy that they've identified that they're going to start working with or have already started to work with to revise some of the language to reflect trauma-informed principles, that would be great to hear. And then certainly if PRA has any suggestions for the grantees around select policy and some suggestions around how you may revise. So if there are any grantees who would like to step up and share, please do. And if not, Dan and Lisa, are there any suggestions that you could provide for grantees around the policy and trauma-informed care?
Actually, this is Omaha Police Department.
Yeah.
I'm gonna nominate Officer Lee Culver to go over the policy that we talked about. Hopefully she's listening.
Thank you.
thank you, Deputy Chief, for volunteering me for this. One of the policies, and I'll just be real brief because I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. One of the policies that we're currently looking at is how we make death notifications. So for example, someone calls in from out of town, says someone has died in an accident from another state, and we're going to send officers to that family or whoever we need to contact if we need to do the actual notification. What we're looking at in terms of how our current policy is, we do have a chaplain program. So we've had some discussions of, the way the policy is written, it's very like religious Christian based. And so we need to be cognizant that there are, family members and community members that, let's say some type of clergy goes with an officer or even makes that notification on their own, that we need to realize that, let's just say a Catholic priest shows up at the house to do that death notification. That is not really being aware of that. Maybe someone in the household had a bad experience with the Catholic Church, or they're not so, so-called religious. So we're trying to make changes to that so that we maybe even change the policy a little bit, asking someone if there's a spiritual leader or someone that they know that we could help with that, that actually death notification. In addition, and you can step in, Deputy Chief, anytime, working on scripting. So, for example, I actually teach this at the Training Academy on death notifications and talking to recruits about, this process. It's not simply going to knock on someone's door and say, hey, your father had a heart attack and he died, we'll see you later. It really is spending time and engaging with that family and that notification and being very mindful of how we're delivering the message and what we're saying, and that it really isn't a knock on the door for 5 minutes, deliver the message, and then just take off. I think our policy is really strong in that, we have the policy that we offer, family members to get childcare, transportation, other things if they need it. But we really do need to kind of change the language and script it a little bit more so that it applies for everyone. And again, it's not just saying that it's going to be, a religious person or maybe being more cognizant that there are other folks in the community that they would prefer to have with them to actually talk about this death notification and talk about the circumstances of it.
Nicely done, Lee.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's very thoughtful.
This is Lisa. I have a couple of thoughts. I think, I wasn't expecting that, to be honest with you, as the policy. So it's very thoughtful and very thought-provoking. I think one avenue might be if you have contacts in the community, and that broadly speaking, the community is to almost have a, maybe a focus group of families who you have had to do death notifications with, or have gone along with officers to do those, and to really have a open discussion about how they could be more sensitive, or what kinds of resources would be most helpful, like primary resources, like you said, childcare. I know in child sensitive arrest policies, that when the phone call is made, if someone's there, finding out if there's children there or if there's someone with them. But ask people who've been through this, what would have made it less difficult? What would have maybe made it a little easier for them? That may be one way to rethink the policy.
Great, thank you. So I did want to turn, while we have a few minutes left, we may just run a couple minutes over 4 o'clock, so I apologize for that, but I just wanted to go through exercise 3 really quickly for folks. You all should have received this in the latest email from Rachel, which was the update to the invite. It will be attached in there. So Allison, could we share exercise 3?
Can you see it now?
Yep, it is up. Thank you. And if you could just scroll just a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Red, that's good. Again, so, okay, so this exercise is taking a look at the policy that you've chosen in exercise 2 and now starting to apply it to practice. Again, looking at the 6 key principles of the trauma-informed approach, so that's safety, trustworthiness, as the example we just heard, providing some choice for the people who are going to receive the death notifications. And then just really thinking as a team about implementation. I can tell you in some of the work release programs, parole programs that I worked in, we did some of this in terms before we implemented. So we held a focus group with both staff and with participants to sort of gauge some interest, or, you know, is this a change that's necessary for the program, or will people benefit from this change? You know, consider the administrative capacity of your team. You know, you want to try to pick something that as a team you can really sort of wrap yourselves around and be able to have some impact on it. Higher level policies and organizations certainly are something to look at. However, they may require a bigger lift down the road. Then pilot the practice, identify some barriers, challenges, and areas for improvement. I think, you know, nothing is going to be perfect off the first shot. So I think, you know, doing a little pilot is good. I know that we did that with what we would do is we would take a group of participants. So if we were changing a community access rule, we would take a group of participants and test that with them first to see if it worked. And so I give an example here, and to go back to Michelle's question about literature around environment, this is coming from a parole residential program. And so the point of the example is to really sort of generalize this a little bit. So while conducting a walkthrough of the community program, we noticed that the signage informing participants' expectations had language that seemed restrictive and punitive. And again, most signs contain the word no, followed by the prohibitive behavior. And so what we found is that we really wanted to start to promote the behaviors we wanted to see. And so, for example, in this parole program, people had to fill out community passes to get access outside the program. And a lot of the times the signage around community access was no passes, no community access. And so what we did is we changed language to be more positive, more engaging. Meet with your case manager, get outside of the program, things like that, to really encourage people to be engaged and not sort of restrictive. Again, we talked about cultural considerations, certainly something to think about in implementation. Who is in your program? Who are your participants? Non-English speaking participants, something to consider around signage. And then, like we've talked about, Allison mentioned gender considerations. And again, so in terms of like the physical environment. So one thing we found was how, and again, this is an example of signage, but I think can be applied, how it was presented. So here we tried to say, when we took a look around the program, a walk around the program, we had a lot of signs that were taped to the wall. The tape was dirty. The corners were all curled in. And if you sat there as someone, as that this is a place that's providing care for people, is that somewhere where you would want to stay? If you walked into your dentist's office and that was what you saw on the wall, you might have some increased anxiety about being there. So I think how something is presented, it really says a lot. And the larger change that came out of this, so this was just a particular program, is that the organization as a whole developed a policy that signage had to meet a specific standard, which it had to be framed, it had to be in a consistent print, there had to be some color to it. So it had to be engaged, not just sort of a sterile, flat environment. And so what we found is that it did have an impact. People felt more encouraged by the surroundings. So so that's what the example I provide. And so this exercise is to get teams to go back, pick a practice that you think is manageable, you can achieve some sustainable change, and see where you can take it. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa or Dan on anything closing on this exercise that you want to inform people about in terms of practice.
Dan, do you want some closing words here?
Sure. I think those are great points, Ethan, too. One, I think environment is important in terms of how people behave, as is expectation. And the signs that you talk about, there was always the negative expectation, right? Rather than the positive expectation. That goes to trauma-informed principles, which are respect and trust, and trying to build those kinds of things between staff and the people that you're working with. So I think, and there's a lot of examples of environment kinds of modifications that can be made. So the other issue that I like that you said, Ethan, is start somewhere, right? Pick an issue, get people around the table, and begin to talk about these things. And as you're developing your program, and pick a policy and begin to change it. And what recently, actually not so recent, a few years ago, I participated in a roundtable around restraint and pregnant women in correctional facilities. Well, it was stunning, the variability around corrections and how women are transported, pregnant women are transported out to OBGYN appointments if that was necessary, or even to a hospital for birth. And I mean, it was abhorrent in some instances. But there are a number of things that can when you start to look at your policies and again get some input in from the people that you're working with, the offenders, that you can begin to address. So it can be something that can be addressed relatively quickly if you get the right people in the room to address these things. And I think it wouldn't take a lot of time in the groups that you have to raise these issues and just brainstorm a number of issues, pick 2 or 3 of them to begin to work with.
Great. Thank you, Dan, for that. So we are at time for today. I wanted to thank everyone for attending today's learning community. It's been an excellent conversation, and certainly looking forward to our next session on August 19th. And we will put a list of resources that have been mentioned here today, including the slide deck, and get that out to folks as soon as we can. Thank you all.
And people can check the chat. I put a couple of resources in the chat for them.
Excellent.
And I'll run through the slides here now too before we close out, so that, and we'll send out the copy of the slide deck as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.